Hello and welcome. I'm your host, Geoff Shullenberger, and this is Compact Conversations, the podcast where I sit down with one of Compact's contributors to discuss one of our articles. So this week I'm joined by Darel E, who is a columnist for us at Compact and also a professor of political science at Williams College. So thanks for joining me, Darel. It's good to get you on the show.
I'm really glad to be here, Geoff.
So Darel has written most recently for us a piece called The Perils of Actually Existing Democracy, which is a rich and theoretically complex piece, I would say, but it is kind of, as I understand it, grounded in recent events. There have been big elections in France and the UK, and of course the presidential election in the US is underway with an increasingly tumultuous situation on the Democratic side. And so I'm curious just what prompted you to start developing the argument you make here, and what was it about these different quite different political scenarios that you saw a kind of common thread in?
Yeah, I think the elections, right? The British and the French elections came in such quick succession that it kind of got easy to just get lost in all of the excitement and all of the details of the results and whatnot. And so that was kind of foremost in my mind. But of course, what's been going on in the U.S. as well with the elite strata of the Democratic Party getting increasingly worried about their own candidate or their own presumed candidate was also there as well. So, of course, we have in the British and the French elections results that are distinctly, shall we say, different from what the vote tally would lead one to expect. So in Britain, of course, we have a tremendous gulf. In fact, one of the largest in British history between the percentage of the vote that the winning party got, that's the Labour Party, of course, and the number of seats that they hold in the House of Commons. And then we have something in France, not quite as extreme, but also a notable gap, right? The right-wing populist party, National Rally, comes in first place, but is among at least the big three factions, the third place, the third ranked faction in terms of the number of seats they actually hold in the parliament. So there's all this complaint about democracy, and you see it in the press, you see it in social media, that these are deeply undemocratic results, that the gap between the number of votes and the number of seats is just so huge. And so that's really the motivation for the piece, I guess, a dissatisfaction with that kind of discourse.
Yeah, and I mean, we've seen this historically in the US with discussions about the Electoral College, the fact that you can have a president who loses the popular vote, but nevertheless is, and this has happened a couple times. So you often hear people on the liberal side of the American political spectrum sort of complaining about the various, what they refer to as anti-democratic features of the system, right? That the Electoral College gives too much weight in this argument to, smaller and more rural states. We hear about, Wyoming has the same number of senators as California, despite Wyoming having like more cows than people or whatever. So you hear these kind of complaints. You've heard obviously around several presidential elections the complaint that the loser of the popular vote can still be elevated through the Electoral College. And so this is, it kind of been echoed in some of these remarks about, oh, well, the French election, the National Rally Party of Marine Le Pen did actually win the most votes, but nevertheless was kind of edged out through this strategic alliance between the kind of centrist and left wing parties to to avoid eating up each other's votes, and so then I'd say more of the complaints were kind of from the right, that this is anti-democratic, that that you heard people claiming that the sort of strategic voting that was orchestrated by the center and left parties to squeeze the national rally out of having a majority was, in some cases deemed by kind of right wing commentators as somehow illegitimate or anti democratic. And so, as I understand it, you're kind of you're sort of throwing cold water on all of these complaints. um, or
Yeah,
you're sort of saying that they're somehow, whichever side they're coming from, they're somehow based on a misapprehension of. And I mean one final point here would just be, we've heard a lot of talk about democratic backsliding, people being, or this election being to save democracy. So we hear lots of kind of talk about democracy, but as I understand it, you're sort of arguing that a lot of this talk kind of derives from a misapprehension of what we're actually referring to when we say democracy.
yeah, I think misapprehension's a good word. Another word I was thinking of is idealization. That I think in a lot of the criticism, particularly of the results of the British and the French elections, is that there's the gap between the votes and the seats, and therefore the opportunity to form a government, is so large that it is therefore by definition, right, anti-democratic, or that anybody who wins the most votes should rule, and that is certainly what we hear all the time in the United States, especially when people like Donald Trump in 2016 did not win the most votes, but became president anyway. But I think it's an idealization of democracy that we see here. That what democracy is, the claim goes, is the rule of the people. And well, what do the people want? Well, they want whatever a majority of the voters in a particular election want. And so, therefore, that's what is the definition of democracy. And that's not false. Certainly not arguing that it's false, but it is, I think, a very, very limited and highly idealized understanding of what democracy really is. And if you look at, and this is part of the reason why I chose as part of the title, really existing democracy. It's kind of a riff on what people used to say about the Soviet Union, right, back in the day. It's really existing socialism, and departed obviously in many, many ways from the ideals that socialists and communists held up as to the way their societies would actually work. But this is the way democracy actually works. It has other goals than simply a close, or as close as possible, representation of the people. And so that's what I wanted to really highlight in the piece, that at the very least, it has goals of stability, and it has goals of effective governance as well. And so, especially when you look at the British system, and really any political systems that are descended from Britain, like ours, or even France, right, which is different in many ways, but still has this kind of majoritarian quality, especially in the second round. And we see it in their presidential elections as well, because they have a 2-round presidential election. The goal is to produce a majority that can claim democratic legitimacy and therefore govern effectively. And that's balanced in all of these electoral systems by this other interest, which is representation.
Yeah, in an unrelated context, I was revisiting some of this book called The Revolt of the Public by Martin Gurry. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, but it came out 10 years ago or so, and so a lot of it is about the Arab Spring and the impact of digital networks on politics and things like that. But he talks about the Egyptian Tahrir Square revolt, and then the election, which elevated the Muslim Brotherhood, followed quickly by a coup, and how in all of these cases there was kind of debates about what was truly democratic, right? And this is an interesting point that I think, if you look at history, kind of particularly outside of the kind of democratic core, this is actually pretty common, that you have military coups that are actually justified by reference to democracy, right? That
Yeah, indeed.
another example I think of historically is in Argentina, when the Peron regime, the first iteration of the Peron regime, was overthrown, that the people who undertook it did essentially claim themselves to be defending democracy, in the form of a coup, right? And this is actually what happens when the Egyptian military ousts the Muslim Brotherhood. They appeal to these massive crowds of millions of people in the streets protesting the Morsi government and saying, "Well, we have democratic legitimacy to carry out this coup because of these crowds that are." Resoundingly rejecting this government, which was, of course, like elected a year prior, with a majority vote. And so, you see, and I guess in these more, fragile countries where democratic institutions aren't as well established and have been, broken at various points, and overtaken by pretty overtly authoritarian government. You see this kind of contest happening, right, where the people who are elevated through the democratic process are often then ousted, and the people who oust them, often the military, will actually appeal to democracy to claim that what they're doing is the really democratic thing. So I don't know. I mean, this is kind of an interesting example of, if you pan out from, countries. I mean, France, interestingly, is, of the three countries we're discussing, the least stable, right?
Indeed.
It's the one that has undergone the most tumult, and the Fifth Republic is relatively new, and arguably was kind of installed by way of a coup in some accounts historically. And
Yeah, the
so I mean, that's maybe the most extreme instance. The U.S. and the U.K., are at this point some of the most stable. But it strikes me that these contestations about, what democracy is, what's the vehicle by which the democratic will is reflected, just keep coming up and coming up again. And in some ways, maybe the more stable countries are the ones that have found ways of kind of building that tension into their system. I don't know if that.
Yeah, I mean, so in the piece, I talk a little bit about the mechanics, right, of how these results came about, and in Britain, of course, it's a pretty straightforward first past the post system. You win the most votes in a particular legislative district, and you win that seat. And in the United States, we have that for the most part. A first past the post system. Not everybody does, right? We have different kinds of unusual primaries in a few states, and runoff kinds of elections in Louisiana and stuff. But this is how you can have, a party, the Labor Party, that won under 34% of the vote, having the second largest number of seats and the largest majority in British history. And so it seems certainly that in the UK, this is accepted. I mean, there are some people who have complained about it. Nigel Farage has been saying that this is unfair. And at one level, you can hardly blame the guy. He won 14% of the vote and got 5 seats, right? Sinn Féin won 7 seats off of less than 1% of the vote in the entire country. But then at the same time, I think the British people are more or less willing to accept these kinds of outcomes. And so there is this kind of accretion maybe of custom and tradition and legitimacy around these kinds of electoral institutions. And I think you see much the same in the US, right? Even though you have people, mostly nowadays, at least on the left, because they're the ones who are losing from these systems, who complain about the Electoral College and want to get rid of it. But there's been essentially no movement of any kind, at least that I would call reasonably effective, that has gone towards getting rid of the Electoral College and moving towards kind of a national popular vote for president. France, as you noted, is different. And I just saw in the papers today that all the big labor unions, which of course in France are mostly organizing state workers and therefore have a lot of power to completely freeze up the entire country, are threatening to go on strike unless the left bloc gets to form a government. So there are these gaps between votes and seats and votes and representation, but there also, I think, are these important kind of sensibilities of the political publics, if you will, on whether we can accept these or whether we can't. And it seems like France is the country, because especially they're split up into 3 pretty equally sized blocks that seem to really, really dislike each other, that they're going to have, or at least Macron being the president, is going to have a very difficult time putting something stable together.
Yeah, so this goes to one of your theses in this piece is where you say democracy is not a form of rule, but a form of legitimation. And so I think that's, maybe one of the most key statements you make there. And perhaps you could elaborate on that a little bit more,
Yeah,
because it seems to, be a sort of, pithy formulation of part of what you were just getting at there.
Yeah, so my thinking on that comes really from two sources. One of them is a woman named Margaret Canavan, who was writing in the 80s and 90s for the most part. She's passed away now, who wrote this really interesting piece on populism. And there is this critique of populism, right? We see this especially in the results in the French election. That was democracy done a disservice because National Rally, which won the most votes, is not going to have an opportunity to try to form a government. It is just absolutely out of the question. Or is the defeat of National Rally by these kind of machinations of what they call in France the cordon sanitaire, right? The center bloc from Macron and the left bloc getting together and dropping out their candidates so that there'd only be two-way races, and therefore you could defeat National Rally, which was effective, and it came to pass. Was that the victory of democracy? And nobody can seem to agree. Well, Canavan's argument, or her insight, which I really like, is that democracy has fundamentally two different aspects to it. She calls one of them the pragmatic dimension of democracy, where you kind of have to elect people, and then those people have to go and do stuff in the government, either as legislators or executives, and actually pass legislation and make decisions and rule. But then there's this other dimension that she talks about, and she calls it the redemptive dimension. And this, I think, taps into much of the kind of ideal qualities of democracy. That the redemptive dimension of democracy is where the people believe that they can fundamentally control their own lives and rule, that they can change their own societies. They don't have to rely on, any kind of external forces, and they can and take power and change their own lives and change their own societies. And of course, that latter dimension is an ideal. At some point, she calls it an ecstatic kind of a belief or experience. You can kind of see it we can see it in lots of the videos. If any of your listeners saw them after the results of the French election were released, and huge crowds in Paris who are celebrating. They're having an ecstatic moment where they feel that the left has won, and now they're making demands on Macron, saying, you have to let us rule, even though they're nowhere close to a majority. But it is this ecstatic quality of democracy that says that the people shall rule. But of course, in real life, the people can't rule, because the people is not an actor. There's no such group called the people who can then go out and do things in the world. And so for Canavan, there's this gulf, if you will, between the redemptive and the pragmatic dimensions of democracy. And you can never overcome that gulf. It will always be there. And so she calls it the shadow, and that's what I call it in the piece. And the other kind of inspiration of this idea is Carl Schmitt, who talks about, in his interest in talking about sovereignty as actual people making actual decisions, that the people are not an actual actor. They're not a person, or they're not a quasi-person in the world. But he recognizes that in the modern, or I guess we'd just call it kind of the 20th century and onwards, as you were talking earlier, Geoff, right? Everybody wants to say, I'm a Democrat, right? Even remember the name of North Korea is the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, right? Everybody wants to claim that word because it's a good word in our era, but it is a form of legitimacy. It says that this government represents the people, because the people must be represented. They can't rule directly. And so then where do we go? We have all of these constant fights that are baked into the cake of democracy about debating who are the people and how can they be represented? How should they be represented?
Yeah, I'm sort of reminded of these protests after the 2016 election, where the one of the main rallying cries of the sort of anti-Trump protests was "Not my president," right?
That was one of the
And
weirder ones.
and I remember that being, and I remember actually some sort of liberal, acquaintances, friends who were sort of troubled by that, right? And remarked, well, yeah, I mean, I hate the guy and think it's a travesty that he was elected, blah blah blah. But like, he is your he is your president. um, so there was some kind of sense of like, well, this is the mechanism by which representation happens, and if you deny that, or if you say that there's something illegitimate about this mechanism, then you're starting to enter some troublesome territory. Seemed to be the instinct. I mean, I remember some people kind of remarking on that particular slogan being troubling, even if they agreed, largely with the protesters about everything.
Yeah, I
Uh,
think one sees this especially in reaction to populism, because right, the fundamental claim of populists, at least in Western countries, who are mostly familiar with right wing populists. Although look at the left in France now, right, the Mélenchon left, La France Insoumise. They're, I would say, a left wing populist movement. Their claim is we represent the people, and so the reaction against that claim is not just a defense of liberalism, which it is usually, but it's also at least a claimed defense of democracy, right? We have to defeat the right wing populists, whether it's in the Netherlands or in France, or, I mean, I think the last, maybe not the last thing, but Nigel Farage, I don't take as very much of a right wing populist. He has some populist qualities, but people want to paint him as such. Certainly Donald Trump could fit into this category. That to defeat right wing populists is to save democracy. And so what I think we see there is this fight over who is the people and what kinds of mechanisms can we represent the people. And so I think we do have a lot of arguments against right wing populism, that it is anti-democratic, which is a weird thing, right? Especially when they seem to be riding high in the saddle now. Although, right, we see some challenges to that claim too. And so it is to save democracy, to ensure that votes don't matter, or they don't matter as much as they might matter in other circumstances. I mean, just look at the fact that National Rally won a larger percentage of the vote in France than the Labour Party did in the UK.
So I wonder if it makes sense to say that a lot of the discussions, arguments, etc., that are being had about democracy in recent years should perhaps be shifted to discussions of legitimacy and legitimation. And I mean, would that be a reasonable takeaway from your piece, that some of these discussions could be more productively reframed around questions of legitimacy and legitimation?
I think, I guess I'm kind of thinking kind of on the fly, Geoff, of what you suggested, because at one level, the legitimation is rooted, I think, in the selection mechanisms, right? The electoral practices themselves, but then also how the public feels about those. And so there could be attempts to kind of shore up the legitimacy of those particular institutions, say in the United States, shoring up the legitimacy of party primaries. And certainly this is what Biden and his supporters have tried to do. They've tried to say, hey, I mean, this is the July 8th letter that Biden released, where he said that it is fundamentally undemocratic to try to unseat me, right? I won an overwhelming majority of the votes in a process by which everybody agrees is democratic and legitimate. And so therefore what you're doing now is, he didn't say it in these exact words, but I think this is a pretty clear reading, is he saying it's illegitimate for you to try to do this to me. And so I think it's hard to have a debate about legitimacy directly. I think we have to have it kind of indirectly, if you will, or we have to have it mediated by a debate on the one hand about institutions of representation, but then also, and this is where democracy just can't, it's a problem that can't be solved, right? It's the problem of the people. Who are the people? And therefore, this is where we get all of these fights all the time about immigration, because immigration is, I think, at a particular level, a fight about who is the people and who gets to decide who is the people. And so that one is a debate that I don't know. I don't know if we can talk about that one, or we can kind of solve that matter, unless we want to do something like dramatically restrict immigration. And so you do have some countries, right, in Europe that have gone this direction. And I think they don't have that many debates about who is the people, because that one's kind of been at least temporarily solved. But it sure seems like Britain and France and the US are a long, long way from putting that question aside.
Another thing that strikes me is whether this, and I remember from I lived in Chile a while ago, and have written some recently about the politics there. And one of the things, as I was kind of learning about the history and the various, and in the scheme of Latin America, Chile, it's known for obviously the Pinochet coup and that period of dictatorship, but in the scheme of Latin America, it's one of the more stable countries historically. But it is also it's had a presidential system, so like the US and like France, it has, a sort of has had a strong executive and a legislature. And so there's that kind of division. Um, and this historically, the one other major coup in Chilean history was in 1893. And there was actually a divide. And it was essentially a civil war in which, I believe it was the Navy took the side of Parliament and the Army took the side of the president. And so you had basically a civil war between two branches of the military, each of them aligned with one particular, sort of claimant to power. And so I'm curious, that and I remember coming upon the idea that these sort of split systems were, and I suppose France would be an instance of this, where you have that kind of divide between the president and the legislature being inherently unstable because they, counterpose kind of two means of representing the general will, each of which has a kind of legitimate claim to do so. So I'm curious, if you think that, and of course, one thing that's kind of remarkable about the United States is overall we've, better than many places, managed to make that work. Although obviously we see many, tensions arising from it. But in any case, I'm curious whether that, and then of course in the UK, you have basically the system where, what historically would have been the kind of executive is a symbolic figurehead of the monarchy, and then you have,
Right.
essentially a kind of system in parliament where as you said, the majority is empowered to, essentially pass legislation, by the way the first past the post system, sort of empowers the the party that, even if it wins a relatively small plurality, it can essentially govern unchallenged in parliament. And so I'm curious, just what you make of the difference between those systems and these kind of more split systems versus these kind of more unitary systems.
Yeah, you mentioned, the French Fifth Republic a little earlier, and it's created, and De Gaulle kind of lays down the law, right? I mean, if you want me to come and save France, right, save democracy in France, we need a new constitution, and we need a constitution that creates a very powerful and independent executive, right, independent from the legislature. And so they move from a parliamentary system to the kind of mixed parliamentary presidential system that they got today. But exactly for this purpose, right, to have more stability. I think you can tell a similar kind of story, although less extreme, right, in Italy, where the country is famous, right, for these continual cycles of government, right? Government's going to kind of last about a year or 2 years, and then they fall, and then you get another government, and really since the early 1990s, the length of governments has stretched out a little bit more, and so you see people, like a Maloney or like a Berlusconi, right? These kinds of figures have risen, where even though you have the old parliamentary system, there's kind of a change in political culture to some degree, and there's been attempts to change the Constitution, which have failed, to create more stability in terms of government, and that's something that, yeah, exactly, in a presidential system is created to produce intentionally, right? We want a stable executive that is going to be autonomous from the legislature. But then, of course, at least in the United States, we get all of our famous systems of checks and balances and the opportunity to impeach and the veto and all of this stuff. So at some level, you look at a system like the United States, and at least to my eye, it seems like the primary purpose is to make sure that nothing really ever gets done, that you've balanced power so exquisitely that nobody has an ability to do much of anything. But then again, right, it does try, or at least every kind of political system tries to balance, I think, at least the democratic ones, these interests in stability, these interests in effectiveness in terms of effective governance, and then these interests in democratic representation. And I think that's a combination of those things is really what produces legitimacy. So, you could have a military coup in Egypt or some other country. And it could be quite legitimate because that new military government is producing stability and effectiveness, and so can make a claim, therefore, and perhaps a reasonable claim, to democratic representation. Now, in terms of institutions, we want to see that ratified through things like elections eventually, and you do kind of see that stuff for the most part. But I think that point about democratic legitimacy, even, I think it's wrapped up in stability and effectiveness as well as representation.
Yeah, another example that has come to mind for me recently is I went and reported from El Salvador earlier this year, and you have a president there who I think it's safe to describe as a dictator, but I think it's but what's part of what's interesting is that and our columnist Juan Rojas, in a longer piece he wrote on El Salvador for American Affairs, kind of lays out this, the position that it's fair to describe what he's established as a dictatorship. I think it would be helpful to be able to talk about that more neutrally, though. I mean, interestingly, he himself, for a while had his Twitter handle "World's Coolest Dictator," so he hasn't been entirely averse to this self-description, but I think it's when you see this discussed, people will kind of ridicule this idea on the basis that he has been, he is legitimately popular and was definitely legitimately reelected by a very wide margin. Now, that was in violation of the clear violation of the Constitution that prohibits reelection. Um, but nonetheless, his I think it's just indisputable that he's extremely popular. And so, I think it gets to some really fundamental questions, like what's going on there. But it's also interesting to me that like people forget that. I think if you go back to Rome, dictator, it's not, it's seen as a thing you sort of need sometimes. It's not it's not like it's not just a sort of term of a sort of derogatory term, right? It's something that at certain points you're in a crisis situation, and so you need a dictator, and then hopefully the dictator eventually, or when you have an honorable dictator who's a staunch, sort of Republican, they will eventually cede power, back to and return to the more standard Republican form of government, once the crisis has passed. And so I don't know. I mean, it's kind of interesting to me, going back to what you said about how everyone wants to be a Democrat. So it's like people say, well, he can't be a dictator because he was elected, but I think perhaps those aren't as much at odds, right? Or perhaps we assume, oh, if he was a dictator, then he would be seen as illegitimate, but he's seen as completely legitimate by the vast majority of the public. So so again, it's kind of striking that I think you can have legitimacy even in a situation where you have pretty much eroded whatever we like to imagine as the checks and balances, and the things that would secure us against dictatorship. It's kind of interesting to see that uh, this is a clear case of, I would say, a country where you can have both democratic legitimacy and what is in effect a dictatorship at the same time.
Yeah, there's this attempt by many, and one of the people that I mentioned in my piece in Compact is political science Jan Werner Muller, who's written a lot on populism, and one of his big critiques of populism is that it is fundamentally, I guess he wouldn't probably say anti-democratic, but it's anti-pluralist. And that's, I think, by what he means to suggest that it's anti-democratic. But he wants to say also that it is illiberal, and so therefore to be liberal is to be democratic. They are the same thing. And I think we can see in an example like El Salvador that it's helpful for us to really analyze the world, try to understand the world, and then engage it to separate democracy and liberalism. Right? You can have an anti-democratic or undemocratic liberalism. I would say that 19th century Britain is a good example of that. Not a very democratic system at all, but a fairly liberal system, especially for its time. And then on the other hand, you can have a democratic system that's not especially liberal. Maybe that's an El Salvador. Maybe that is better to say, depending on what you think of Viktor Orban's claims about illiberal democracy, that might be an example as well. And so I think these things don't equate to one another, and I think it's helpful for us to separate them out, at least analytically, and then to think about what are the mechanisms by which people have rights and individual rights, and what are the mechanisms in which people are represented in the state, especially through things like elections. So I think that separation, analytically at least, between democracy on the one hand, liberalism on the other, is really helpful to us. Because that seems to be the big claim, right? The big argument in a place like El Salvador, I think, from what I've read, and you'll know better than I, Geoff, is more that it's illiberal, right? That there are these rights that people should have, maybe to due process or to speech or whatever they might be, and these are being violated by the government in its attempts to fight the gangs and throw half of the young male population in prison. It sounds like, and that strikes me as more an argument about liberalism than about democracy.
So I believe it's a year of a record number of elections taking place around the world. I can't remember, but I believe I read somewhere at the beginning of this year that it's like the most elections that will have taken place around the world in any year in history or something like that. I'm curious if there are any others that you're kind of looking out for, or think will be interesting to observe, and or if there are any others that have occurred recently that have struck you for whatever reason.
Yeah, I think the Dutch election earlier was an interesting one, where the right wing populist party, right, the party for freedom, party of freedom, I can't, the Geert Wilders party, comes in first place and actually formed a government. It took forever, but this is the way the Low Countries do things. That I think was pretty remarkable and notable. At least in terms of kind of lots of the things that we're talking about here today, in terms of populism and immigration and representation and who are the people. Looking forward, though, I think Canada, which is going to have an election presumably next year, is also an interesting one to look at. Trudeau seems to have pretty much burned out all of his goodwill, and seems like he is probably going to lose. But you have these kind of, I guess people are calling them right-wing populist movements, even in Canada, which some years ago everyone looked at Canada and said, well, there's a sensible country, right? Right-wing populism just is going nowhere in Canada. Well, now they have the Reform Party, and they have the truckers movement, which Trudeau came down on very hard, and these kinds of things. So that's another country I think is quite interesting. And then for my own personal interests, the Scottish elections, which will be next May, also will be at least very interesting to me, because the Scottish National Party, which has been a research interest of mine for a while, really got its clock cleaned, and it is going through a real bloodletting inside the party now, and that, I think, is what you see when political parties in competitive democratic systems lose and lose badly. They can fall very, very far. They can be on the absolute top of the world, and then to descend into absolutely devouring one another inside the party. So I guess those are the things I'm interested in looking forward to in the near future.
Excellent. Well, we look forward to your columns. I imagine touching on some of these places and these themes. So, thanks for joining me.
Yeah, thanks for the conversation, Geoff. It was great to be here.
So, please, everyone, check out Darel's most recent column and subscribe to compactmag.com/subscribe to make sure you don't miss any of his future columns. They come out monthly, sometimes more frequently. So beyond that, always remember Compact is an independent reader-supported publication, so we need your subscriptions. And also, if you like what you're hearing on the podcast, please rate and review us on your favorite channels. So thanks again, Darel. Thanks, listeners, and see you next time.